Hi, my name is Simon and I'm a trans-disabled man.
I had the privilege of sitting down and listening to Simon, who has a lot of interesting things to say about disability, trans identity and art.
My name is Simon, I'm 22 years old and I'm a trans guy with a dynamic disability. I was diagnosed earlier this year with a condition that's called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. It's the third type, or the hypermobile type, so it's the only one without a type of genetic testing to confirm the diagnosis, which means that instead you go through a bunch of clinical testing, which basically means that the doctor kind of bends your joints in different directions and checks the range of motion and stretches your skin in funky ways and uses a measuring tape to see how far it stretches, as well as kind of asking about your medical history, about family members and their medical history, and it's a bunch of appointments to figure out what's wrong with you. Which, I mean, in medical terms, something is wrong, which in itself is a bit of a complicated concept, because if you have a chronic illness or a permanent disability, you kind of have to come to terms with if you're okay with the concept of something being wrong with you permanently, which I am. I am okay with something being wrong with me, because I do consider my EDS kind of a malfunctioning of my hardware, which doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be changed or adjusted or that I have to replace those parts, because I can't. But it would feel a bit strange for me to pretend like nothing was wrong when it does actually impact my day-to-day life in a, to me, restrictive manner. Not to say that everyone with EDS has to say that something's wrong with them.
And this is how Simon's EDS affects his day-to-day life.
For example, I have quite a bit of chronic pain due to over-flexing of my joints. I'm hypermobile, which I think about 20% of the population qualifies as hypermobile, but in some more extreme cases it can cause quite a bit of pain because the joints aren't really supposed to do what they're doing, and then your muscles also tend to overcompensate for your joints because your body doesn't really trust the joints, and that can cause a bunch of muscle pains and constantly sore muscles from over-exercising, even though you're not over-exercising, you're just going about your day. It also causes me to subluxate, which is kind of right before you dislocate something, you sublux it, and it's that something slips out of its correct position. And then primarily it's my thumbs and my shoulders. So I say that I have hyper-opposable thumbs instead of just opposable thumbs. Because instead of just being able to bend it forwards, I can also bend it backwards. I'm not really supposed to do party tricks, but at this point, those joints are so soft that it doesn't really harm me to do those things, and it doesn't really do any damage because I don't actually have to stretch them to do it. I also get quite faint. It's due to a common side effect of Ehlers-Danlos, which is low blood pressure. So I wear supportive stockings most days, and due to my ankles and knees being quite wobbly, I oftentimes walk with a cane. I'm sure there are other ways that it affects my day-to-day life. I wear braces, like the ones on my wrist, and I have those for my fingers that bend backwards as well, my knees and my ankles. And I wear a bunch of compressive wear that does actually decrease some of the muscle pains.
Simon has spent some time reflecting on the overlap between being transgender and being disabled.
I think there's a huge overlap between a queer identity and a disabled identity. And I've been open about having a queer identity since I was about 12 years old, but I didn't really start identifying as disabled until I kind of got it confirmed that my issues were to be more or less permanent. And I felt that coming to terms with daring to identify in a certain way definitely included quite a similar journey. There is this acknowledgement with using an identifying label as disabled or queer that society isn't really built to fit you, and you sort of have to carve out a place for yourself, and you have to find your community. And there is both a kind of resistance in that, but also a kind of, sometimes at least, a kind of sadness in acknowledging that. But it's not necessarily a permanent sadness, it's more of a passing sadness that you can actually gain quite a lot of strength and empowerment from, because acknowledging that you have to carve out your own place and then succeeding in carving out your own place, or succeeding in finding a community that carves out its own place, can be quite empowering and a rather joyful experience, which I found with both. I've also found that there's a lot of overlap in how my EDS affects me and how my gender dysphoria affected me, which has kind of led me to thinking about dysphoria as a potential disability. For example, when binding, I couldn't really bind due to chronic pain and my EDS making my chest incredibly flexible. So my rib cage kind of compressed too much within a binder, and it kind of became the ace bandages thing, but even with really good binders. But binding restricts your movement and restricts your day-to-day life in a way that I would say is quite similar to what my EDS does. And not being able to go to the gym, not really daring to speak in public, not really having the ability to navigate life the way other people do, can be quite disabling. Obviously then, gender dysphoria for some people will be a disability. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that. And I think that by acknowledging that, we can have a greater overlap between the disabled community and the trans community especially. And I think both communities could really benefit from being a bit more critical of the norms that makes us want to separate them. Because admittedly, I think to some extent it can be a bit ableist, insisting that dysphoria cannot be disabling. And to some extent, I think it can be a bit transphobic, claiming that dysphoria cannot be bad enough to be disabling. So I think we kind of need to work in both directions there. Not to say that like everyone in either camp says that, but just things I've heard.
And this might be applicable to other communities as well.
I think a lot of marginalized groups can really benefit from being a bit more in tune with what other people outside of their own specific community are telling them. And that goes for how a lot of LGBTQ organizations need to listen more to Black and Indigenous people of color, for example, and how we've received a lot of very well-founded critique about how we create quite like white-centric spaces.
Simon is also an artist and incorporates these thoughts into his art.
I think as well, as an artist, I find it quite important to think about beauty in different things. I think as a queer person, especially as a trans person, it can be quite difficult to find our bodies represented as beautiful and as valuable. And I feel the same way as a disabled person, that I can sometimes feel quite ugly with my mobility aid and my braces, and it can be quite a difficult thing seeing yourself as anything but a mismatch of mobility aids and braces and gender-conforming surgery scars, when really you just want to be beautiful. I think a lot of people just want to be beautiful, and I found that within art, oftentimes we have specific structures to display things as beautiful. For example, we have the halo. I've worked a bit with iconography and a bit with painting saints and saintly pictures. And as soon as you put in visions of godliness and divinity, and especially as soon as you give something a halo, within art that thing will be depicted as beautiful. Regardless of what it is you're actually depicting, if you put a halo on it, usually the impact that will give is that thing will be seen as beautiful. So I worked quite a lot with putting halos on disabled bodies and on queer bodies. And I've drawn shirtless people with gender-confirming top surgery scars and added halos to them, which to me has been a very powerful way of reclaiming my body and seeing it as something beautiful and holy and important. It might be worth mentioning that I am also Christian, so obviously my view is from a very Eurocentric Christian perspective, but at least for me it has been quite important to reclaim that kind of divinity and holiness, and adding that to bodies that look like mine, but also bodies that look like my friends. And drawing different types of bodies in different types of situations, and drawing bodies that might not be depicted as beautiful as something holy has been a very healing experience.
And Simon also has some thoughts on how art can be a useful tool for marginalized communities.
Art in general is a very important tool for resistance, but I think that sometimes maybe we focus a bit too much on the resistance part of activism and less on the community building part of activism. Because art isn't just a tool of resistance, art is also a tool of communicating to other people that you are in fact there and you do see them and there is a space for them and they are beautiful and worthy and seen, and that they can find a tiny bit of community just in you and in your art. And I think both the trans and queer community in general, but also the disabled community, has really taught me about that. And the good parts of those communities have really taught me about how to not just be acting in resistance, but also be acting in compassion and be active in compassion. And yeah, I really enjoy how those communities especially work with art. I have a better idea of those communities because I belong to those communities. I'm absolutely certain that other communities work with that as well, but they aren't mine, so I can't speak for them. But I've heard similar things from people who belong to other communities, that once they find spaces where they work more with inclusion than just resistance and more with compassion than just resistance, they have found that it kind of becomes easier to rest and heal and mend. And I think that's really beautiful, and I think that's something we all can keep working towards.
If you enjoyed watching that video, please like, comment, subscribe and share the video. I really appreciate you showing your love in that way. If you also want to support the channel financially, that's possible via Patreon, but really no pressure. See you next time!